Okay, I think we are ready to start. It is time to begin this conversation. I am glad to have everyone here. Good afternoon and welcome to CAL's Six Bridges Presents event. My name is Tim Nutt and I am director of the UAMS Historical Research Center located at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences in Little Rock. And we are the only archives in the state dedicated to preserving the history of the health sciences in Arkansas. And I also started my career with the Central Arkansas Library System, so I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to continue to participate in the programming of one of the best public library systems in the country. Thank you all for joining us today for this virtual conversation with historian and author Catharine Arnold on the 1918 influenza pandemic. Apropos, considering the current situation that we find ourselves in. Most of us probably never imagined that we would be living in such a time as we're living in now. And the phrases 6 feet apart and the new normal would become so embedded in our daily vocabulary. Of course, today's COVID-19 pandemic continues to draw comparison with 1918's Spanish flu, as it is known. Historians started focusing on that influenza pandemic as its 100th anniversary approached in 2018. Late last year, and especially earlier this year, focus shifted back on the earliest 20th century and how that pandemic played out, how it affected people's lives and the economy, and how one of the deadliest disease outbreaks in recorded history was confronted. As throughout the world, the 1918 influenza pandemic had a devastating effect on Arkansas. It's estimated that over 7,000 Arkansans succumbed as the flu made its way through the state in late 1918, early 1919. This number is most likely low, though, because record keeping was minimal at best, and some deaths were not attributed to the flu or reported at all. And the African American communities, particularly in Eastern Arkansas, were hard hit. We're glad today to have Catharine Arnold, author of Pandemic 1918, Eyewitness Accounts from the Greatest Medical Holocaust of Modern History. As I mentioned, and she's going to talk about her book, how the influenza pandemic made its way across the globe. Here in Arkansas, you know, as we're dealing with this COVID-19, back then in 1918, it affected all parts of society. The state was put on quarantine for most of October 1918. Camp Pike in northern Pulaski County, which had an estimated population of about 52,000, was on quarantine for nearly a month as the flu first showed up there. The schools closed, the universities closed, restaurants closed. It all sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Family members could not attend funerals, and oftentimes there were not enough able-bodied, healthy men to dig the graves. The Little Rock Public Library, still in its infancy, was also caught up in the quarantine, just like it is today. It closed on October 12th, 1918, and remained closed until October 28th. So a long time that it affected the library services. Arkansas did not have the proper resources to combat the flu pandemic. They were dealing with a measles epidemic, and the state health department was in its infancy. It had only been established in 1913. The flu still had effects across the state. A new constitution was supposed to be voted on in November of 1918. Because of the low turnout due to the pandemic, the constitution failed. And because of that, women's suffrage and a prohibition on alcohol, which had been included in the new constitution, also failed. So it's always nice to look, and interesting and informative to look at the past. And so we're so pleased to have you here, Catharine, to speak on your newest book. And I'll tell a little bit about you before we move in. You read English at Girton College, Cambridge, and you hold a further degree in psychology. You're a historian, best-selling author, and you've written extensively on the social history of London. So we're very pleased to have you here today. This book has been very well received. And so I'm going to turn it over to you now, and let's just start this conversation.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. Yeah, I suppose the strangest thing of all is that 3 or 4 years ago, when I was sitting in this house working on the book that would become Pandemic 1918 or Panic 1918, I had no idea that such a thing would happen again. For one thing, I thought we had better medical resources. And I also, at the time, was reassured by the thought that the British Home Office and the Health Service in my country and the Georgia Centre for Disease Control and the White House had built-in plans to deal with such a pandemic emergency. Sadly, for a variety of reasons, which we don't have time to go into right now, when the today's pandemic hit on both sides of the Atlantic, we were not prepared. And it's really a testimony to the emergency services on both sides of the Atlantic that it hasn't been even worse than it already is. But as this meeting progresses, hopefully we can look at the similarities and the differences and why, although it's tempting to think that yes, this could be another Spanish flu, in many ways, although it's horrible, and it's horrible for the number of people's families who've already died, it's not mercifully on quite the same scale as 1918.
Well, we have something to be thankful for, I guess. If you would, let's start out a bit about you walking us through the arc of the 1918 flu pandemic and give us a summary and timeline as it spread across the globe.
Yeah, well, basically, Spanish flu appeared to come out of nowhere. It was first sighted early in the spring of 1918 in the army camps of Europe and simultaneously in army bases in the US and indeed the UK. And it had the features of a pandemic in that instead of just starting one place and moving on to another, as you might expect, its narrative was different. The thing about a pandemic is outbreaks spring up at the same time, like wildfire, in different places. So, for instance, historians and doctors have never been quite able to determine which came first, whether it started in Kansas at Fort Riley, whether it started at Etaples, which is a huge army base on the Western Front, or it came from China and was carried west by Chinese laborers who've been recruited to help with the war effort. You asked me to describe the kind of narrative of how it took over so quickly. That was one of the most frightening aspects of it, and that's where it does bear some resemblance to coronavirus. It was first seen early spring. That was called the first wave. As that died back, a second, a more deadly wave tore into the United States and Europe in the summer of 1918. This too receded, almost as if people either succumbed to it or they developed herd immunity by being exposed to it. Then there was a third, an even more deadly wave, really triggered by the armistice, because all over the world, people understandably got together to celebrate the armistice. I mean, they'd come through this terrible war. They'd survived a mysterious bout of killer flu. So you can understand why everybody's rushing into the streets, every city in America, every town in the UK. Throughout Europe, people were celebrating that the war was over. And with it, they kind of hoped the Spanish flu. But of course, what this did was, everybody flocking together like that, just caused another third wave. And the spike of that one was peculiarly difficult. And it didn't really die back and disappear until early in, well, I'd say the summer of 1920, to be cautious. So the similarities with coronavirus, yes, it seems to come out of nowhere and strike fast and kill a hideous amount of people. But there are a lot of differences between the coronavirus and actual Spanish flu, which we'll come on to in a moment.
Well, you mentioned that you had no idea, you couldn't see into the future that we were going to be in the situation that we are today when you started writing this book. But so what was your impetus to write the book?
Well, as you've already kindly mentioned, I've done quite a bit of work on the social history of London, and I have in the past specialised in writing about the grim underbelly of London life in particular. So as I'd already written about death and burial and madness and the treatment of mental health and the sex industry and capital punishment in the legal system, it seemed fairly natural to turn my attention to Spanish flu. At first I thought, well, I'll just write about Spanish flu in London because there's enough material in there for a book. I was also interested in it because my father, who was considerably older than my mother, lost his parents in the Spanish flu epidemic, and he would never speak about it. And I'm just going to close the door because I can hear them getting supper ready. Just give me one sec. That's better. Right, so I've got this interest in it as a subject because of my background in writing about really grim, unhappy, miserable things. And I've also got the direct link in having a family member who'd been bereaved, well, orphaned by it. Unfortunately, I had very little material to go on. I'm still in the process of trying to find out what happened to my father's parents, one of whom appeared to be Canadian. But I put that to one side. I just remembered my father's total horror of it and the way he wouldn't speak about it, the way that generation often were about the war. Or I later found some of the people I knew who'd lost family to Shoah or the Holocaust. There was the same deadly thing that had happened in the family history that was too terrible, too awful to discuss. Anyway, so there I am, preparing a book proposal on it, which at first, the publishers I showed it to, including my usual ones, Simon & Schuster, were just sort of like, meh, No, it's a bit grim even by your standards, we don't see a market for it. But I did eventually get taken up by St. Martin's Press in the States and Mike O'Mara Books over here. And there was a lot of interest in it, and I did a kind of circuit talking to people and met a lot of people in audiences who had got perhaps not direct memories of it, but who had lost family members. So it was kind of in their memory. And that was it really. When I was sitting there working on it, I'd often kind of contemplate looking out at this lovely quiet street, real suburbia, kids playing, babies going past, lots of blossom. And I did occasionally think, what would it be like to be sitting here and see your whole world changes and the most horrific things are happening? But it didn't really occur to me that this would come in the form of Spanish flu. I mean, I've often, like all of us, been concerned about terrorism or some kind of perhaps stupid and unnecessary global conflict. But I don't think anybody thought that coronavirus was just going to appear so rapidly. Mm-hmm. And hence I've become a kind of resource. So I get phoned up or emailed by journalists who just want another angle. And having done a bit of time as a journalist, I know you want somebody who can give you some details and bring the story to life. Mm-hmm. And that actually brings me to another thing that was mentioned in your email, Tim, which was about why did I choose to write about people's experiences. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yes, please go ahead. I'm very fascinated. First eyewitness accounts, first person accounts are so important to the historical record, and they give a really the human element to what could be a purely academic, purely scientific book. And so having those eyewitness accounts are so important in a history like this.
Well, that's what I thought, because my background is social history and fiction as well. So I always gravitate to things which will bring it to life for the reader and for people to speak to the reader who are relatable, who they can identify with. And what I sort of mined numerous accounts from different sources. Some of them were Some of them were already in the public domain and had perhaps been used before. Some of them I had to dig deep, go to various libraries, look through people's life stories, their diaries and so on. But that was the main thing for me, because Spanish flu studies had begun to become a thing in about the last 10 years. So there were quite a lot of academic tomes that I could draw on. There were books about the virology of it, epidemiology, even the geography of Spanish flu. But these were very much written by academics for students or for other academics. So what I wanted to do is really bring it to life. And as I say, I found a variety of accounts. Some were by people who later became professional writers, like Mary McCarthy, author of the group, Catharine Ann Porter. This was rich material. So although they'd been through these devastating experiences, Catharine Ann Porter nearly died and her hair turned white. Mary McCarthy lost her parents and some siblings. They actually got, I suppose they consoled themselves by writing about it. But there are other more vivid accounts of people who'd been interviewed, say 20 or 30 years ago, and they were simply ordinary people who'd lived through it. So in the book, I've got Columba Volz, growing up in Philadelphia, South Philly, and her dad's a tailor, and she tells about just the horror of how things changed, how she loved to listen to the church bells in the church at the end of the road, and how the church bells went from being that celebratory sound on a Sunday morning, summoning people to prayer, to the steady bong, bong, bong that's played, the tolling bell that's played over and over and over when there's a funeral. There's a little girl called Anna Milani who's growing up also in Philly, in the Italian community, and she was only 8 years old, and she lost a brother. And her accounts are of just watching the undertaker's shop at the funeral parlour across the way, seeing all the front doors on the street with black crepe tied to them to indicate that somebody had died. All of this is kind of this eyewitness testimony. Mm-hmm. Even 100 years later, it's particularly impactful. Mm-hmm. And although there is a place, obviously, for books that are more scientific and technical, like my friend Laura Spinney's book, Pale Rider, I think there's also a place for my more sort of humane, anecdotal approach.
I agree with you. I think there's history has so many different facets, and you can look at it in so many different ways. And I think having this personal aspect, this personal first-person experience history of it, just adds so much to the bibliography of the flu. So kudos for you for doing that and coming up with that idea for that. Speaking of the first-person accounts do you have one that moved you more so than the others? So you mentioned a couple of them.
Yes, yeah, it's a hard choice, because basically what I had for 18 months, 2 years was, as one of my friends who's a bit kind of woo-woo, a bit psychic, explained, it was like all these ghosts coming at me, really, through my laptop. I had all these stories, and it was quite painful to be the reciprocant of them. But there's one in particular, although it's a hard one to choose. I'll just read you this little anecdote.
Please, I was going to ask you to read a few selections from the
So this is, again, Philadelphia, which really suffered very badly. And there's Selma Epp, who's a little Jewish girl growing up, and her entire family succumbed to the flu. And her little brother Daniel was particularly sick. And when Daniel was really, really ill, he was only about 3 years old, she said, for help. They stood in line for hours outside Pennsylvania Hospital, but were turned away. They came home and tried their own remedies, but nothing helped. Everyone in my family, my parents, my aunts, and my brother Daniel, everyone up and down our block was sick. There were no medicines, no doctors, nothing people could do. My grandfather was very religious. He was Orthodox, and he wore his prayer shawl, and he prayed, hoping God would take away the illness. Everyone in our house grew weaker and weaker, and then Daniel died. My aunt saw the horse-drawn wagon coming down the street. The strongest person in our family carried Daniel's body to the sidewalk. Everyone else was just too weak to protest. There were no coffins in the wagon, just bodies piled up on top of each other. Daniel was 2. He was just a little boy. They put his body in the wagon and took him away.
That's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking. Very, very sad.
And unfortunately, that scene played out all across the globe. You know,
Yeah.
You know, family after family were impacted by that.
Family after family. There are gruesome accounts, again in the States, in Cape Town, of trench burial, basically, of people just being carried, wrapped in blankets because there were no coffins to be had, or taken in wheelbarrows. There are accounts back in the States of people being handed a coffin but told to dig their own graves.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other accounts of having to pick up the bodies from outside the houses, just like the horse-drawn cart in Selma's story. All sorts of vehicles were put into service, so quite often the cops would go around in Chicago with a paddy wagon, just picking up the dead bodies and taking them to the morgue. Then, of course, the morgues began to run out of space, and in my hometown, Nottingham in England, home of Robin Hood, one undertaker was really resourceful. He looked at the public baths across the road, and he asked the council if he could use the public baths, and they agreed. So all the water was drained out, and this big swimming pool was used as a temporary mortuary where they could keep the dead before they were buried. But yeah, it was just, it was a frightening time, and mercifully things are not quite as bad as that here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was the flu, and then of course the war coming at the end of the war. Those were just 2 seminal moments in people's lives, you know, that grew up in that, you know, who were born in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Those really impacted their memories and,
Yes.
and their lives.
Yes, I mean, I think that's correct, because, you know, the whole world had gone through 4 years of war, and everybody had suffered to a greater, lesser extent. Either, you know, you'd lost members of your family away at the war, or you'd gone through food shortages and queuing, and in London, Zeppelin raids, or you'd been a displaced person. And then, like God's bad joke, in the 4th year of the war, along comes this mysterious killer flu and takes out people who were sometimes spared. So you've got things like Kingsley Conan Doyle, who is the son of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Sherlock Holmes. Kingsley survived 4 years in the army, 4 years fighting for his country, came home to recover from his wounds. The wounds began to heal. Then he was killed by Spanish flu. Leif Arbuthnot, or I think it's Leif Anderson, I think his name was. Anyway, he was a war hero. He had a VC. He was up in combat, killing the Red Baron, shooting him down at the age of 18. Then, unfortunately, he was shot down himself and became a POW in Germany. Escaped from that, got home, only, sadly, to succumb to Spanish flu on the last day of the year.
Mm-hmm.
So there are so many tragic stories.
Well, and I would imagine that if anyone, most anyone, I should say, digs into their family history, they're likely to find someone who did die from the Spanish flu.
Definitely. Oh, of course, some who survive, because I get a lot of email and just a lot of comments on Twitter and so on, or Reddit, and they'll say, oh yes, you know, my grandma had it, but she survived. Mm-hmm. The fact was, and distinction again, excuse me, between Spanish flu and coronavirus. Spanish flu was very unusual in that it seemed to target the young and the healthy, because what it would do when you became infected, it would set off your body's autoimmune system, rather like HIV/AIDS. So your body is basically fighting itself to get rid of the flu. And the younger and the fitter people were, the worse the reaction. It's called a cytokine storm. What was remarkable was that these young people who died, healthy people, quite often pregnant women, because you've got two systems there fighting for survival. And the usual flu victims were ignored. You know, the oldest and the youngest population in the population, those are normally the people who are killed. We've got the opposite here now with coronavirus. We've got older people who traditionally are the targets of killer flus and pneumonia, and people with pre-existing morbid conditions, you know, people with diabetes or who are obese or who are being treated for cancer. They tend to be the victims now. Still heartbreaking for their families, of course, but a completely different sort of virus.
Well, and then also the Spanish flu, it was fast acting. I've read some accounts that, you know, people, they were first diagnosed and then 12 hours later they had died. So it was really fast acting.
Yes, I think what it was is that people could contract it perhaps up to 48, 72 hours earlier. But they were asymptomatic for a period of time while they were kind of harboring it or incubating it. And then suddenly, perhaps within 2 days of meeting another infected person, or as you've said, 12 hours, they would be collapsing in the street themselves, hemorrhaging and worse. And then another distinctive feature of Spanish flu was it's called heliotrope cyanosis, which is a fancy way of saying blue skin, because as they ran out of oxygen, they were choking for breath. Obviously, their skin would turn blue, the lips would turn blue, and generally, by the time a patient was in that condition, they were gone. Very, very few people came back from it. Oh yes, and your hair turned white in many cases. So Catharine Arnold, in her memoir, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, she says that when she was convalescing, she noticed that her hair had turned white, and she was only a young woman and she had to diet for the rest of her life.
It's just, it's amazing to think that the flu just had so many impacts on people. I mean, I would not necessarily have ever thought that the flu would turn your hair white, you know. So it's just amazing, and it's so interesting that you brought all these different aspects into your book. It just makes it so much more relatable and so interesting to read. So thank you for doing that. I wanted to we talk about see and get your take on what, in your opinion, were the biggest failures or successes that the countries, individual countries or governments or even people had during the 1918 pandemic. Were there some things that worked extraordinarily well, some things that worked awful bad, or what?
Well, let's go with the sort of the bad things first. Because in terms of Spanish flu, one of the problems in the States particularly appeared to be that there was no national cohesive strategy. There was no top-down directive saying, you're all on lockdown, you've all got to stay indoors, etc., etc. It was run, as it is now, I believe, on a case-by-case basis. So some states would say, yes, we're going to completely go into lockdown, as you described in Arkansas. Other states took a more laissez-faire attitude, as in St. Louis, and this definitely was reflected in the mortality figures. So, for instance, in Seattle and San Francisco, they took a pretty hard-line approach. In Seattle, you were not allowed on public transport without wearing a mask. At one period in San Francisco, the mayor enacted, although it wasn't strictly legal, but the mayor ruled that you could not be out in public without a mask, and this controlled their death rates accordingly. We saw the same thing in the UK to a certain extent, that again, there was no sort of public health system as such at that point. Forgive me, just been talking to people all day. So there was no Department of Health in those days to say, this is what you should do. In some cities, such as Manchester, they took a very rigorous approach and lives were spared. But the problem in both countries, and indeed across the world, was that the war was still going on, and the war was considered the most significant factor. So for instance, in London, Walter Fletcher, who's a top medic, top research scientist, goes to Sir Arthur Newshome, who's a top civil servant. And Walter says, right, we have a problem with the transport here because I can tell the disease is spreading because it's being spread around the country by people using public transport. So could we not restrict public transport, particularly in London, particularly the tube and the trams, so that we can, as we say these days, stop the spread? But Sir Arthur Newshome just turns around to Walter and says, we can't do that. You know, it would be most unpatriotic to stop people traveling to work. This is the important thing. The war is the most significant factor, and to worry about flu at a time like this is just unpatriotic. So even when health advisors and experts were doing their best to say, we need to get a handle on this, we need to lock this down, if you like, at the same time, the civil servants were turning around and saying, no, it's not necessary. You can see a lot of parallels there with what's happening now. In terms of successes, yes, I've already mentioned San Francisco is a good example. I think the other sort of long-term success to come out of it is flu research itself, because Walter Fletcher's work at what was then called the Medical Health Council, I think the Medical Research Committee, that became the Medical Research Council, and that became a huge research body in North London, where they spent the rest of the 20th century looking into flu and developing a vaccine. Unfortunately, that wasn't anything like available before 1938, but Walter Fletcher in particular dedicated his life to it. And so did many army medics, because obviously there was a military application in making sure that there was a vaccine as soon as possible. And unfortunately, many doctors like Graham Gibson of the RAMC were actually killed. They became martyrs to science, as one obituarist put it, because they were killed by the flu in their labs, trying to find a vaccine for it.
It's interesting that you mentioned sort of the, you know, the different approaches that some governments had or municipalities had than others. Here in Arkansas during it, it was the U.S. Health Service was in charge of the flu response. And mainly, a lot of it, that's just the way it was set up for one thing, but also our Department of Health, which had been only established in 1913, was still, it was in its infancy. And so, but at the very beginning of the flu here in Arkansas, the U.S. health official just sort of downplayed everything and said, you know, this is just the plain old flu. You don't have to worry about it. And so it went on for a few days before he changed his tune and said, you really need to pay attention to this and to do this and this and this and this.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I was looking at some newspapers, in fact, this afternoon, and there were quotes to just, you know, various places in the States, people saying exactly the same thing. This is not significant, you know, this will move. And I was also looking at the former Surgeon General, Rupert Glue, who was an expert and who within days of the first outbreaks really in May 1918, he was saying we have to do something about it. So he came up with a whole list of recommendations, but unfortunately he had no powers to impose them. So he could say observe quarantine, wear masks, stay at home. Unfortunately, this was not kind of something that could be implemented, whereas for good or ill, this time round, various countries have imposed very strict conditions, notably Italy and Spain,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And of course, China, where it first started.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you mentioned the differences between what we're dealing with now with the coronavirus and the 1918 flu, but do you see any parallels? I mean, I know the different waves. There are some people who think that there might be another wave coming in the fall. Are there other parallels or other similarities or differences that you see between the coronavirus and the 1918 Spanish flu?
Yeah, I mean, I think the similarities are the way that it's so contagious and has traveled so fast. The way, in both cases, nobody predicted that a pandemic on that scale would happen so quickly. The way, in both cases, all the governments have had to scramble to try and get any kind of control over it. The fear, I think the fear is worse now, because in 1918 everybody had the war to worry about, and in Russia things were doubly bad because they had the revolution going on as well. So to have experienced Spanish flu in revolutionary Russia must have been one of the most terrifying experiences of all. In some ways, people try to draw military comparisons. I'm always a bit skeptical about that, but I suppose you could say that the situation we're in now with coronavirus is a bit like World War II, only we're all on the same side.
And I have to apologize. They're drilling right above me. So
oh right,
if
I can't
you
hear it.
Something, okay, you can't hear it. Good.
No, I can't. It's not a problem. I had very fast cars going down my street, but that seems to have stopped. So other similarities. Well, on the good side, we see regular exhibitions of neighbourliness, people looking out for each other, people caring for each other. For instance, there's a baby boy who was lying in his cot in Manchester, and the next door neighbour came in and gave him a bottle of baby food before she died herself. And it saved that little boy's life. And he grew up to be Anthony Burgess, who wrote The Clockwork Orange. But there are also, in 1918, there are examples of poor behaviour as well. So a nurse writing in Philadelphia saying, it's dog eat dog, everybody's out for themselves. There were cases of people stealing coffins. I mean, how low can you go?
Mm-hmm.
And there are also, sorry, you go on.
I was just going to say, it's just so, it's so easy to draw these parallels from what we're going through today and through the 1918 Spanish flu, but it's just even though there are these parallels, it's just so unique, and mainly because of unique in people's experiences. I experience the coronavirus, the experience is different for me than it is for you, and it's different from one city to another, and I just find that really fascinating too. Where there's parallels and there's differences in just the individual people's experiences.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, it sounds totally different, but at the moment I'm doing a book about the history of psychotherapy, and one of the things I learned from talking to therapists was that every encounter was different. So every therapist was different and every client or patient. And in some ways, I think that goes for our experience of history as well. So your experience of living through coronavirus in Arkansas would be different from mine in Nottingham. But then on top of that, you do get a lot of shared similarities. So most people tend to sneer at social media, but I found it very useful to look at social media and know that people are going through the same thing I'm going through right now. I think that's one of the strengths of what's happening. The bad side is that news, and terrifying, worrying news, kind of goes pinging around the world within seconds. So it's very easy to die of overload and become permanently paranoid about it. But in the other way, you can communicate with your family through this, or your friends, and there's less of that feeling of isolation. Some of the stories in my book that I just touch on are people whose entire families were locked away because the family was scared of catching the flu. And in fact, they quite often died in fires or from suffocation. Then you had the awful cases of murder-suicides or family annihilations, where somebody, usually the father, would be convinced that they all had flu. And instead of just making the best of it and trying to get through it, he would turn around and kill the family. Quite often they didn't even have flu in the first case. There are accounts of people, jumping off buildings, committing suicide because they thought they got it. To be fair to it, in medical terms, there's plenty of evidence that having had Spanish flu and recovered, many patients did have mental problems and nervous diseases for the rest of their lives. And in many cases, it did seem to include mania in its symptoms. And I would hope that we're not kind of seeing that kind of thing at the moment. I'm not hearing of a rise in suicide under coronavirus. Other unfortunate things, yes, but not suicide.
And we need to be thankful for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to questions here in a second, but I'd like for you to end my questions with you about what would you like for the readers to take away from your book?
Well, in my book, I say that people lived through this horrific experience, and for many of them, life would be never the same again because they lost their mothers or their fathers or their daughters, or they themselves came through but kind of injured and damaged. But they managed to continue and live their lives. And so, although it was a terrible way to lose someone, there are many, many people who did survive and became successful writers, married again, had other families, and found a kind of joy in the world which perhaps they hadn't experienced before because they were nearly having been robbed of life. They felt that there was more to live for. And this takes us back to Catharine Arnold because she's given up for dead. She's lying in hospital. At the last moment, the doctors tried to try a new drug on her, which mercifully works. And she sort of doesn't get out of her bed because she's too ill, but she suddenly thinks, well, from now on, I'm going to live life on my own terms. I've always messed about before. I've never been sure what I wanted, but now I really know what I want to do. I want to be a writer. And she does. So if you have that kind of lust for life, it will come through.
And it really does. You hear nowadays that, we're all in this together, and it's really a triumph of the human spirit, to come through such a traumatic event like that, especially coming off a world war and then the Spanish flu and all these other things that people went through.
Totally.
And to survive and
yes.
And blossom, actually, yeah.
Yeah, something I should add to that, which of course there's quite a lot of testimony from nurses who worked with Spanish flu patients, and Dr. Basil Hood, who ran a hospital in London at the height of the pandemic in London. And these are the real heroes. So just like today, at 8 o'clock, we'll all be out in our street banging saucepans and clapping for the NHS because it's become kind of a ritual. The real heroes of Spanish flu are the caregivers. And one last thing, it was a real breakthrough for nursing as a profession. It became more recognized as a profession because there were so few doctors, and nursing is what you need in flu. It was also a real breakthrough for women of color because for the first time, Black women were allowed to sign up, they were permitted. It's terrible to think that they weren't, but for the first time, they were able to sign up as nurses. And of course, after that, profession never looked back.
Right. Progress in the face of death.
Yeah.
We've gotten a few questions that have come in, and one of them is, and I'm sorry I didn't bring this up before. Could you go into a little bit of why it's called the Spanish flu for those of us who might not know why it's called the Spanish flu?
Yeah. Basically, it wasn't anything to do with Spain. It didn't start in Spain, but it became named Spanish flu because the King of Spain became infected in May 1918. And as Spain was neutral, there was no kind of, you were allowed to write about anything in the papers. There's no kind of censorship. So everybody began hotly debating what this new flu was. And when it cropped up in England, they started talking about the new flu in Spain. So the Times started calling it the Spanish flu. Doctors also gave it that name because they were able to discuss it within the medical journals. Although the Defence of the Realm Act meant that you couldn't talk about it too much because it might scare people and affect national morale. Doctors could talk about it in the BMG and the Lancet, and this is how it acquired its name. It also had its own kind of cartoon meme, which was the Spanish lady, and this was this horrible, rather misogynistic depiction of a Spanish gypsy lady with a death's head, very gothic, very emo. And the implication was that if you spent time with her, you'd get the Spanish flu. And she cropped up all around the world in lots of cartoons and sketches and pictures and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that, you know, and they carried that Spanish theme throughout a lot of the newspaper articles too. You know, here in Little Rock, they'd say, well, the Spanish flu has made its entrada into Arkansas. Yeah. And so it's interesting that they just sort of kept that theme throughout.
Well, I think that was part, the kind of chauvinism that, I mean, chauvinism in the strict sense of the word, that countries show when they're under pressure. I mean, we've, you know, had President Trump talking about the Wuhan virus, and different places called it different names. In Spain, they didn't call it Spanish flu. They called it the disease of the Naples soldier, because that was a show that was running in Madrid at the same time. The Germans called it Blitzkatar, which I think is a wonderful name. And in Poland, they blamed it on the Russians. They called it the communist flu.
Huh.
So there was even an early attempt on the West Coast to call it Japanese flu, because a Japanese warship had been spotted in a nearby harbour. So they thought, right, you know, the Japanese brought it. We love to label things. I mean, now it's not politically correct, but in 1968, when there was a bad outbreak of flu, it was called Hong Kong flu, because that's where it started.
We have another question about your depiction of masking. You have described the gauze masks given out by the Red Cross and others. We are in a local and medical large conversation about masking policies now, and they'd like to know if you have, you know, do you think that is that some people insist that they're helpful and impactful? You know, what was the feeling on masking back then, and do you have any other thoughts on that about masking?
Yeah, the feeling. The mask really became a universal symbol of Spanish flu, particularly in the United States. The majority of the pictures I've looked at in photo archives have been of things like policemen in masks directing traffic in Seattle, masked women sitting at desks, entire masked families with a masked cat. And there's one story about a honeymooning couple who their doctor asked them if they got any symptoms, and they said, well, they'd worn masks but nothing else on their wedding night. And very quickly there was a sort of fashionable craze for different sorts of masks. The mayor, I think it's Mayor Rolfe of San Francisco, used to wear one called the ravioli because of the shape that it took. So the thing is that it may have saved some lives, but the kind of masks that they were using in 1918 really wouldn't have been effective against the virus that caused Spanish flu, because the particles were so tiny that they would have passed through any gauzy material. What you could say for them then was that they might not have protected the wearer against contracting Spanish flu from somebody else, but at least they kept, to a certain extent, any particulates that the wearer was likely to give out. So they didn't protect him, but they protected other people. There was a bit of a hit and miss thing about it. These days, I see a lot of people in masks when I go to my local grocery store, and latex gloves, and some are real masks, some are improvised. There's a big argument in this country about we mustn't try and get masks that are needed for the professionals, you know, for the healthcare people. So you see people tie a scarf around them, or I've got this kind of like desert scarf that I could wear if I wanted to. But then the whole point is not to touch your face. This is what we're constantly told.
Right.
When you're out and you could be exposed to coronavirus, don't touch your face, don't touch your mucous membranes. And yet I stand in line outside the grocery store and I see people sort of, you know, tweaking them, taking them down, lighting a cigarette, having a vape. At which point I think, well, they're probably not actually doing any good whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that we've all discovered during this time is how often we actually touch our face.
Yeah, yeah. And it's always said that that's the way. I can remember my mother saying, you know, don't touch your face, you'll get spots, you'll get flu, you'll get a cold. And to some extent, she was right.
She was. And we have another question. Has the current situation inspired you to keep your own journal of the plague year?
Oh, that's lovely. Yes, because that takes us back to Daniel Defoe, of course, who based his own diary of the plague year on, I think, his uncle's experiences, because Daniel was only about 5 at the time. I keep a diary anyway, and have done for years. So I do tend to note things down. You know, I'll say latest government policy, meh, or so-and-so on our street has died, but mercifully it wasn't a coronavirus related death, very sad. But so yes, I do keep a check of things, and obviously I keep a sort of online diary in a sense that I tweet all the time. I watch the news, I listen to programs. In order to do things like this and be kind of a resource, I try to keep up to date with all the latest developments. And one person asked me last week if I was going to write about this. So far, I've only written a preface to the Korean edition, and I don't think I will in any significant way, because I think by the time we get through this, there will be so many proposals on publishers' desks, and there will be so many people who are really far better qualified than I am to write about it, because scientifically it is far more complex. What we're living through is not just one of the great plagues of history, that's bad enough, but we're having to change our lives significantly in a way that people didn't in 1918. And we're looking at the floods, and our lives are never going to be the same again, whether it's you know, economically, the jobs we do, or our social lives. So it's unexpectedly, I would say, one of the biggest historical events since the Industrial Revolution. Everything's going to change, and not always for the better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have the 1918 flu was a true global pandemic. We have a question as to, was there any place that wasn't affected by the pandemic? Was there a country that didn't get it? Was there an area on the earth that did not see the pandemic?
The Antarctic, and sadly that's about it. Everywhere else, to a greater or lesser degree, suffered. Though interestingly enough, China, where it's now believed it originated, didn't suffer as badly as one would have expected. But this is perhaps because, not wishing to emulate Mr. Trump, but there's a certain truth in the fact that China is the mother of all pandemics, sadly. It's where the great pandemic of the 17th century began, and the Black Death of the 14th century. There are all sorts of reasons for that, which we probably don't have time to go into now.
No, unfortunately, our time is limited. But let me see. There's another question here. Someone asked, how many how many people did it actually kill? And of course, that's just an estimate because we don't know exactly how many people were affected by this. But what's the estimate for how many people were killed by it?
I'll start off with, in the US, 550,000 people more than died in World War I. India, 18 million. That's 13 million in the bit of India that was owned by the Raj, and the rest outside the control of the Raj. Countless numbers in Africa. And Professor John Oxford, who really is the daddy as far as flu research is concerned, reckons it's 100 million. And in my research, I've seen no reason to disbelieve him. More conservative figures hover at the 50 million mark. But I think it's closer to 100 million. And mostly this is based on public records where they're available.
And I think, you know, because of the record keeping back then was not very good, especially in the rural areas. I know in the rural areas of the U.S., the record keeping wasn't the best. And then plus there were some people who just didn't report as the death as being from the flu.
Exactly. I think that's a very good point, because through sheer weight of numbers, what doctors there were around to sign death certificates, say in United States or in rural Britain, would have signed so many that probably by the October of that year, by the fall of that year, they were just scribbling a line.
Right.
And if you're dealing with a population that's already weakened by diseases of poverty, that already has things like tuberculosis, possibly cholera, rickets, starvation, basically. All these factors could also be part of why they died. The virus would have been the thing that finished them off. And there's the other really tragic aspect that people might have survived the virus, but then developed bacterial infections such as pneumonia or bronchitis. And of course, it was before the advent of antibiotics. So now, if we get a bacterial infection after flu, you know, it's easy to deal with antibiotics, steroids. That's it, hopefully a good recovery. That wasn't available. And I think that's one of the reasons. Another explanation could be aspirin misuse, because it was believed that obviously as aspirin brings your temperature down, that could cure you. But unfortunately, I think many people, not being well educated, overdid it with the aspirin and probably died of stomach bleeds.
I want to end with one question, and you might not be able to answer it in the time that we have left, but
okay.
What were the religious leaders telling people at the time about the flu? I know you have there are a lot of these sort of, end of the world sort of theories going around, you know, whenever a pandemic or something like that comes along. So what were the religious leaders telling people in 1918? Well,
there were, as you can imagine, in kind of the more conservative fundamentalist sects of all the major Abrahamic religions, there was a belief that, yes, this was God's anger, this is God's punishment. Obviously, Catholics and Protestants were praying where they could. In many cases, churches were still open. In Poland, horribly, but typically, they blamed it on the Jews. You know, the same old ghastly anti-Semitism. One account from South Africa to end on really interests me, in Cape Town. Botha, who was, I think, the father of Pik Botha, the late South African politician, that General Botha was saying that it was God's punishment because he felt they'd supported the wrong side in the First World War, that they should have supported the Germans and not the British. So quite a few explanations.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I want to thank you so much. This has just been such an interesting conversation with you.
Thank you. I've loved it. It's been great to talk to you all.
Well, it's been great to talk with you, and I want to tell people that someone asked about where they could buy your book. Your book is, I know it's coming out in paperback soon, if it's not already. And here in Arkansas, or in Little Rock, they can go to their favorite bookstore here in Little Rock, maybe go to Wordsworth Books.
Brilliant.
He's always been a big supporter of the library and the book festival, so I hope they'll consider going through that. But anywhere books are sold, people will be able to get a copy of the book.
They will. It came out, I think, last Thursday, the 12th.
Okay.
Last Tuesday. So, and it's been really nice talking to you.
It has been very nice talking to you. You have a great rest of the evening. And I want to just mention to people that we hope that we've enjoyed having you here. We hope people will come back for the next Six Bridges Presents, which will be on June 18th. And thank you very much for being here. We've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.